Welcome to Mile High Reefers. I'm Scott Anderson, and I get tons of questions about keeping clownfish. Now, over the years, I've done a lot of videos on clownfish, but I thought I'd make one encompassing video on how I keep 5 clownfish in this tank and how I have 3 clownfish that use a clam as a host, as well as some general tips and tricks to keeping clownfish. My story keeping clownfish starts in 2006 when I bought my first pair of tank-raised clownfish. If you remember 2006, tank-raised clownfish were really just starting to become commonplace in the market. In my area, they weren't that common, but I was able to hunt down a pair. I wanted tank-raised because they were better for the environment. We weren't pulling them from the wild, and they were supposed to be healthier and adapted to the aquarium environment. So it was supposed to be easier. So I went with a pair of Ocellaris Clownfish, one of which you'll actually see in this tank. It's the biggest one in there. It's my female. It's Nemo. This fish is now 12 years old. So my top tip for clownfish is know that these are long-lived fish. They can live longer than dogs. It's very common for these fish to live over 20 years in captivity. After about a month of owning the 2 clownfish, I'm sad to say that one of the fish jumped out. So definitely get a lid with clownfish. At which point I kept 1 clownfish in that tank until I broke it down and set up my 90-gallon tank, where I bought another clownfish to pair up with Nemo. Now that I have 2 clownfish living in my 90-gallon, it was time to get a Rose Bubble Tip Anemone for them to hopefully live with and use as a host. Now let's talk about the Rose Bubble Tip and the anemone hosting experience. First, you do not have to have an anemone for your clownfish to live a long, happy, healthy life. In fact, my clownfish currently have little interest in my Rose Bubble Tip. Now, the other thing is the terminology with clownfish hosting the anemone. It gets weird. I screw it up all the time. But really, the Rose Bubble Tip is the host and the clowns live within it. But it's a symbiotic relationship, and the clownfish gain protection from other fish and predators by living in the anemone. The anemone actually gains protection because clownfish will protect the anemone, and they'll also provide a food source for that anemone, which is really cool. So this whole symbiotic relationship is cool, but it can be really difficult to reproduce in captivity. Like I said, I have a Rose Bubble Tip in here, and my clownfish have very little interest in living in it. They have lived in my Rose Bubble Tip. In the past, I had a Sabay anemone. They liked that one a lot more. And I even had a clownfish live in a Condylactis for a while, which they really shouldn't like at all. So anemones are cool, but not necessarily, and can be a complete hit or miss. And even clownfish that have lived in and loved an anemone for no reason will move over to a clam, a powerhead, a Euphyllia, anything else in the tank. So don't get too frustrated if you can't reproduce this in your tank. If you can, it's fantastic, but it's really something that you're not gonna be able to force on your clownfish. So I had a pair of clownfish, and the goal was to just live with a pair because common wisdom is if you add more clownfish, there will be major aggression issues, and that you should just stick with 2, and that's what's going to be happy and healthy. Well, a friend at work was breaking down his tank, so I bought his 2 Ocellaris clownfish, and I was scared, but I put them in the tank, and they did fine. In fact, they did better than fine. They broke up into 2 pairs. One lived on one side of the tank, the other lived on the other side of the tank. And it was interesting because when they broke up, they switched partners. So the biggest of the new one moved in with Nemo, and the smaller 2 moved together. What was really interesting is over the long time frame after the 210 was set up, they all kind of migrated to this clam. The clam isn't something they should really want to use as a host, and yet they do. I don't think there's a lot of benefit to this clam, but 3 of them sleep here. The 4th one sleeps up in the Euphyllia, and it's a really cool. They'll actually lay eggs on this clam. It's a really cool thing to watch, and they're so cute when they lay on it. It's a really interesting thing to watch. But really, when I put these guys in, there was no aggression. I've never had any aggression between clownfish. So as things are today, I really wouldn't be too afraid to add more clownfish. It's a big tank. There's lots of room for me to put clownfish, and they can set up their own territories. Right now, I've got 3 clownfish that pretty well live in this one. I've got another one that kind of swims this entire tank. And we've got the 5th clownfish, which we haven't talked about yet. So let's talk about him. The 5th clownfish was in my 5-gallon nano. He lived there, but the tank crashed, so I put him in my 24-gallon. At the time, I had that vermiculate leopard wrasse, and I actually had a pair of clownfish in there. Well, he scared the clownfish. One of the clownfish jumped out. I didn't catch it, so it died on the floor. It was very sad. So I was scared for the other one. I pulled it out, threw it in my 210, and it's done fine. There was no aggression from the other clownfish. He moved right up into this Monipora colony where you see him today, and he's lived there for about a year now. He does really well there. And the 3rd clownfish kind of goes up, sees them. If you want to call it aggression, they kind of just have almost more like 2 dogs barking at each other. It's like a little snapping match. But that's all I ever see out of them. I think eventually the 2 smallest clownfish in here will pair off. But right now, this guy is a very small juvenile. So let's talk about gender with clownfish, because it gets weird. So when you buy your clownfish and it's a little clownfish, it's gonna start off as a little boy. And as it grows older, it could turn into a female. Right now, I have 1 female in my tank, and that's Nemo. Now in the wild, the way this works is you'll have multiple clownfish living in an anemone, and the largest one is gonna be the female. When the largest female dies, the next largest male becomes a female. Imagine if they would have put that in Finding Nemo. There would have been so much controversy, but the movie would have mimicked reality. Now, in my tank, what would likely happen with the 3 clownfish here is that if Nemo unfortunately passed away, my next largest clownfish would become the female. We're talking about male-female bonds, and they absolutely breed. My largest male breeds with my female about every 2 weeks, and they'll lay eggs on my clam. They actually use the clam as the substrate that the eggs go on. It's a really cool thing to watch. Now, I don't try to hatch them. That's a whole nother hobby, and in all honesty, I'm not the person to tell you how to do it. But it is something you can do as a hobbyist if you're interested. You can expand your clownfish into other aspects. Breeding, you can make your own fancy varieties. There is so much you can do with clownfish. So much more than I can ever cover in this video. But the egg laying process is really cool. They'll live there, they'll guard their eggs, you can watch the eggs develop. The sad thing is when they hatch, they basically become food for all the other fish and coral in this tank. But in my personal situation, I have no good way to raise them up. For tank size, really a 24-25 gallon tank is going to be kind of the minimum. You can actually keep really small clownfish in 5-gallon tanks if you plan for growth. When you get little baby clownfish that have just gone to a saleable size, they are so small that they do great in a 5-gallon tank. They'll grow slowly. So while a clownfish will live for 20 years, they start out that big, but they will get to like 4 inches. But it takes a long time for them to reach their maximum size. And in fact, there is no maximum size. A clownfish will grow its entire life. So most of the lifespan of a clownfish, you're probably fine with a 20-gallon tank. But for a fish like Nemo, right now at 12 years old, I would think that's a little small. If you want to keep more than a pair, or you want a harem tank, bigger is better. Make sure they have room to get away from each other. There can be aggression. I've never seen it, and I suspect, I don't know it for a fact, that you're better off with tank-raised clownfish. And remember, you don't just have to do the wild caught like I like. You can do many of the fancy varieties, your Da Vinci's or Wyoming whites, or whatever you personally find. Me, personally, I just like good old-fashioned, wild-looking Ocellaris. Feeding your fish is important, but clownfish are not picky. They can live solely on pellets and do just fine. Me personally, I feed New Life Spectrum and LRS frozen food. It's got a nice blend of chopped up fish and clam and all kinds of just yummy stuff for these guys, and they do really well. They're happy, they're healthy, and living a long time. Like all fish, clownfish can be susceptible to ick, marine velvet, and they are well known for being susceptible to Bruchinella. So quarantine your clownfish before putting them in your main display. If they have a problem, you can treat them in QT and you don't infect the fish that are in your main display. The big downside to clownfish is, while mostly peaceful towards other fish, they have caused me some problems in the past. First, they've killed multiple starfish in my tank. I am guessing that in the wild, starfish must be a predator, so any starfish that's gone near their eggs, they've destroyed. So starfish, at least in my tank, cannot get close to their eggs or they will be killed. Also, clownfish are known to bite. Yes, I've been bit by sticking my hand in the tank and trying to touch the coral that my clownfish was trying to use as a host. For the most part, in my opinion, clownfish are the best starter fish. They can be tank raised. You can have your own clownfish farm if you want to. You can raise them. You can take this hobby as far as you want it with clownfish. There are so many special variants if you want to go that route. They're super hardy. They'll live a long time. They can live in smaller tanks when they're young. They do pretty well if your water parameters swing. They're super hardy fish and great for the beginner. So thanks for watching this video. There was so many avenues I could take with it, but really I just wanted to tell you guys how I got where I'm at and hopefully answer a lot of those questions that I keep getting. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.